My name is Sarah Jane Pomeroy, and for those of you who might be watching this and don't know me, I'm a researcher on human trafficking and modern slavery. I completed my master's dissertation on this subject in 2020. The first stage of my dissertation took place before any lockdowns happened, and then in the latter stages of my dissertation, we were in lockdown, the first lockdown. And in the conclusion chapter, I took the evidence that I had gathered from modern slavery studies and governmental organisations and Christian groups that are addressing the subject. And I came up with responses to modern slavery. My main conclusion was about the church needing to be a place of refuge. And underlying that, now, given everything that has happened in the last 18 months, had I known the extent to which things were going to go, I would have outlined some presuppositions, that is, the kind of underlying ideas and thoughts. I would have made that a lot clearer. But I took things for granted. Such as the church being open, the church being accessible. Okay? Now, that has not been the case for the last while, with government restrictions. Even in Northern Ireland, when churches were given the freedom to stay open, churches closed and churches were moved online. Now, I have decided to take it upon myself to research this and find out what's going on. What are the implications of the church being closed? This information doesn't get applied to churches. Nobody is actually taking this information and saying to churches, you need to apply this, okay? I'm going to say this needs applied. I studied applied theology. So if you want your churches to be filled up, and you want to see our society changed, then you need to do something. If you want to see something about modern slavery changed, if you want to see people set free, you want to see victims released, you want to see people survive this, then you need to do something. I'm going to let everybody else speak to you, okay? I'm going to let the UN speak to you, I'm going to let the government speak to you, I'm going to let scientists speak to you, I'm going to let healthcare professionals speak to you, okay? And my intention is to inform you. I'm going to inform you. I could give you my opinion. My opinion means nothing, okay? Maybe it means something to some people, but to the majority of people it's going to mean nothing. And if I put these guys on the screen and these voices before you, I'm not one witness anymore, okay? Crime and contagion, the impact of the pandemic on organised crime. The institutional response to the pandemic and the consequent reshaping of socio-economic norms worldwide will affect how criminal networks operate, as well as the nature of law enforcement responses to them. Vulnerable groups such as people who use drugs or victims of human trafficking may be particularly hard hit by the impact of the virus. Reports are already emerging of criminal groups who have exploited confusion and uncertainty to take advantage of the new demand for illicit goods and services. Extensive lockdowns and closure of borders to human movement will make it much more difficult for human smugglers to ply their trade into and across Europe. Okay, they may nevertheless attempt to capitalize on the desperation of migrants who are stranded before reaching their final destinations. Upping prices and transporting them becomes more challenging. For those of us who are in Northern Ireland, trade within Europe is going to be a massive problem because people aren't going to get into England unless they're going to jump on a dinghy and get picked up by the RNLI. The main route into the UK was through the Republic of Ireland in refrigerated lorries. Northern Ireland was designated as a transit country. But with the current protocol and the Irish Sea border, that has basically just put up a blocker between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So my theory which if I could prove, I would. But my theory is that with the RC border, the Northern Ireland changes from a transit country to a destination country. Just simply because of logistics of getting people across the new European border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So that is concerning. As is the case during all crises, the impact and risk fall hardest on the most vulnerable in society, and this often includes those who are implicated in criminal markets. In the context of a global health crisis, many of these groups stand to become even more marginalised, as health resources, social welfare and policy responses are targeted towards the immediate coronavirus threat, a primary concern. Okay? Safeguarding measures, both by state and civil society groups, may become more difficult to implement as free movement is restricted. Identifying victims and potential victims of human trafficking may similarly become more difficult. Keeping victims isolated, both physically and emotionally, is a key strategy for traffickers to control their victims. This will be made significantly easier in lockdown situations, where victims may be vulnerable, may be unable to escape abusive circumstances, and behind closed doors may be exposed to more extreme forms of abuse. People who are unable to access police or social services may be further victimised by physical or sexual abuse. Compounding the problem, identifying victims of human trafficking for sexual or forced labour often relies on identification and reporting by the public, which is to become significantly less or fall away completely as social distancing comes into effect. We have been told, okay, to accept that these are just kind of little things that we've been asked to do. We've been, sanitize your hands, keep your distance, stay at home. These are just little things we want you to do, but they're only little things to us. They have wider social implications. Okay? You're less likely to encounter or witness a victim of trafficking if you're not around. This is a peer-reviewed journal article. In a COVID-19 environment, victims move into unemployment and back into vulnerable positions where they are exploited. There are increased risks to those already enslaved and to those vulnerable to slavery. That's two important categories. The people who are suffering hardship financially, they're the kind of people who are vulnerable to slavery. Okay? So we have those who are already enslaved and those who are vulnerable to slavery. So it's important to keep those two things in mind, because it's not just about saving people who are already enslaved, but also preventing more people from falling into the net, so to speak. Okay? It's the difference between proactive and reactive. Okay, reactive responses are responses to something that's happening right now. We're trying to save people, but a proactive response is preventative. COVID-19 increases the risk of vulnerability to modern slavery as states struggle to provide appropriate protections, private businesses seek ever cheaper forms of labour, and criminal organisations exploit the crisis for illegal gain. In short, the pandemic has had a significant impact on freedom of movement, freedom of association, severe restrictions on economic freedom, business operations, the ability for countries to conduct genuine and transparent elections, and other organisational activity that comprise many of the social economic dimensions that underpin the SDGs. It's a fancy word, isn't it? What is an SDG? If we go here, it is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The modern slavery one is Goal 8.7, Target 8.7. We take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labour, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025, end child labour in all its forms. So, kind of interesting that you have the UN on one side, promoting these sustainable development goals, but you have the WHO and international governments taking steps that are actually putting this in jeopardy. So there are conflicts, clearly there are conflicts. So that's target 8.7. They acknowledge that this is actually going against the international targets that they have set, and which governments have signed up to. Survival at the expense of the weakest. I love these titles, okay? These guys have a really great way of just putting it as it is, okay? These guys aren't conspiracy theorists. These are academics. This is not Prison Planet or Infowars. This is the Journal of Risk Research. Risk Research, okay? Did you even know that existed? I didn't until I read this. If this doesn't make you ask questions, right, then I don't know. Besides businesses, governments have also sporadically relaxed some modern slavery prevention measures. In the UK, for example, labour providers can temporarily provide workforce into sectors with high modern slavery risks without requiring the usual gangmaster's licence to make workers more readily accessible. Whenever your primary priority is controlling the spread of a pandemic, everything else goes to shit. We want to have a conversation about inequality. Let's talk about the handling of the pandemic, okay? Because it is the privilege of a very small minority of people who do not have any other risks at life that can make laws and break laws when it suits themselves to protect themselves. It's very saddening. With physical distancing and other lockdown measures in place, it became much more difficult for victims of modern slavery to access support and disclose their situation. They have fewer opportunities to visit faith and community organisations, attend in-person site instructions, speak to fellow workers, or call helplines that are essential infrastructure of modern slavery detection for many businesses. And that is the important key there for the church. These are the laws that we have both repealed and enacted that put the most vulnerable into even more vulnerable situations, where they have an increased risk of exploitation and a diminished chance of escape and seeking help. And the church has co-opted into this because the church has had a role in helping these people, and that has been mitigated by our involvement. So let's go on and talk about churches. These guys they spoke with 12 survivors of modern slavery who had experienced rough sleeping before entering the NRM. That's the National Referral Mechanism. So if you go to the police or a social worker or a doctor and you say, I have been a victim of modern slavery, then they refer you to the NRM. The NRM is a process. It's also a data collecting exercise, where you get access to help through the state. If you need help sorting out immigration papers, getting accommodation, getting medical checks, and also having a case against your traffickers or exploiters. That's the NRM. Not everybody who is a victim of modern slavery goes through the NRM. There are quite a large number of people who never enter the NRM because it is a brutal system and it brutalizes people. So that's acknowledged across the board. Who would they go to? Right? All interviewees told us that a victim of modern slavery who was homeless would approach a church, mosque, or other religious organisation for help if they knew where to find them. Here's a quote. I approached the church for help and they helped me. I thank God for guiding me to that church as they called the Salvation Army and they helped me. Quote, I believe church is easier. That was my experience. I was going to church to get connected to God, but it was not easy, as you don't trust anybody. It was hard for me to express the challenges I was facing. It was the second church I went to who had a pastor appointed for the homeless. And this is the responsibility of the church. You know, it doesn't matter whether you don't have people trained in this area. It doesn't matter if you haven't got a program for this and if it's not in your vision. If these people are going to come to you, if these people see you as light and as help, then you have a responsibility for them. I'm not going to let anybody think that the current system that we have for the church engaging in modern slavery is right. No. I have seen firsthand and experienced firsthand the deficits and how this is being done and how this is being handled. Okay? Yeah, sure, I did my research, but there have been situations that have come about where I have contacted these people for help, not for me personally, and they did nothing. They were powerless. They were also apathetic. Okay? All I want to say is that we need to do better. Okay? And this isn't about your Sunday morning entertainment, reading something really horrifying and leaving with this sense of, oh, I've done something about that and I've heard about it now and that's that. That's where my responsibility ends. It's not. Okay. Next article we have. Impact of COVID-19 on children. Special focus on the psychosocial aspect. Although medical literature shows that children are minimally susceptible to 2019 coronavirus disease, they are hit the hardest by psychosocial impact of the pandemic. Being quarantined in homes and institutions may impose greater psychological burden than the physical sufferings caused by the virus. School closure, lack of outdoor activity, aberrant dietary and sleeping habits are likely to disrupt children's usual lifestyles and can potentially promote monotony, distress, impatience, annoyance, and varied neuropsychiatric manifestations. Incidences of domestic violence, child abuse, adulterated online contents are on the rise. Children of single parent and frontline workers suffer unique problems. The children from marginalised communities are particularly susceptible to the infection and may suffer from extended ill consequences of this pandemic, such as child labour, child trafficking, child marriage, sexual exploitation, and death, etc. Parents, paediatricians, psychologists, social workers, hospital authorities, government, and non-governmental organisations have important roles to play to mitigate the psychosocial ill effects of COVID-19 on children and adolescents, to provide the basic amenities, social security, medical care, and to minimise the educational inequities among the children of the different strata of the society as our foremost priorities. Now, this is going to get heavy, guys, okay? I'm not going to glaze over this. This is the kind of information that people need to know. Reports of child abuse, neglect, exploitation, and domestic violence are on horrendous rise at the time of COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. Okay? Like COVID-19 brews an internal cytokine storm. That's a wee bit of science for you. Its cataclysm has heralded a perfect storm for the offenders to abuse children through several online platforms, as schools are closed and children are playing excessive and uncensored time online with loneliness and humdrum daily routine. Pandemic followed by economic downturn will hurt the poor children the most and nourish the pre-existing inequalities even in countries with mammoth economic strength. We can be terrified of a virus, but I'm terrified of the bigger picture of what's going on, and I can't use COVID-19 as an excuse to validate my maltreatment of people and my apathy towards people and my neglect of people. This is just a really disturbing statistic. Before COVID-19, approximately 152 million of children were already engaged as child labour. Almost 50% of them are doing hazardous work. COVID-19 will only add numbers by several millions more to them. Parting the educational shortcomings, low-income families are awaiting forthcoming threat of post-COVID-19 economic recession, which has promoted child poverty, with perennial effects on children's health, well-being, learning achievements. Children from poor households have to engage themselves in income-generating activities due to economic hardships, leaving school leading to permanent disengagement from formal education. Again, we also need to be able to distinguish what are the effects of the pandemic and what are the effects of policies. Okay, so differentiating between the effects of the virus and the effects of policy. Okay, because you can have a virus. The effects of the virus are symptoms: coughing, sneezing, fever, loss of taste and smell. If you are in Asia, that also includes gastrointestinal effects, but seemingly don't affect Europeans. Anyway, United Nations again, Human Rights Special Procedures. Gia Marinaro. Had to say that with an accent. The impact and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on trafficked and exploited persons. Okay? I have my quotes here on my page. Page 2, I'm going to read these out. It's social, this is COVID-19, the socio-economic consequences are already making precarious and marginalised people more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. Do we need anybody else to say that? I don't think so. I think that's been overemphasised throughout the whole literature. That's just consistent. Without access to shelters, this is page 6, healthcare and psychological assistance, victims of trafficking, even when identified, might be re-victimised. Why? Because they're on that fringe between safe and not safe. They're here, right? Here's safety, here's exploitation, right? And if you're here, right, you're sort of almost getting towards safety in terms of financial stability, independence, security. If you're here and an economic crisis hits, boop, you're into exploitation. If you're here and a pandemic hits and the government produces lousy policies that put your life in jeopardy, boop, you're here, right? Okay. And that includes people who have come out of modern slavery and are now here. They haven't got all the way safe yet. They're still here. They're still vulnerable. Boop. Goodbye. Safety. Refuge. Page 7. The COVID-19 is exacerbating the vulnerabilities of children to sexual exploitation. The closure of schools could heighten the risk of online sexual exploitation, with children spending more time online, possibly without the constant oversight of their parents, mummy and daddy, and exploiters who could easily reach them. Fortnite, PUBG, online games where your children are communicating with people who you do not know. Yeah, I tell my kids that these things here, right? I do not let my kids walk through Belfast city centre at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? When there are people there who are dangerous and harmful. I do not let them walk in any city at any time of the day by themselves. I do not let them go and mingle with strangers on street corners. Yeah? But people think it's okay to hand this to their child, right? And put them in the position of contact with some people who they wouldn't let them physically have contact with. Right? This here brings all those harmful people into your house. Okay? So, we need to be more discerning. And right now, when physical children are hard to come by because everybody's in houses, well then this is the doorway. Yeah? This is the doorway into your home. This is the key, ka-ching, hello child, here's a game, I'm going to communicate with you. And children are not discerning. Children have not had the experiences and relationships that adults have had. Kids are wonderfully innocent. They talk to the postman for like 30 seconds every day and think, oh my goodness, he's amazing. He might be amazing. You don't know. You've seen like 0.001% of his life. Okay? Kids don't know. You need to look after your kids. And page 7. Number 7, demand for sexual materials from isolated and bored offenders across the world has continued. Risk that families. This is really, really bad, guys. Brace yourselves for this, okay? Trigger warning. If you do not like to hear this sort of thing, then turn this off, but then maybe you shouldn't be watching this anyway. But here's the reality, right? There is a risk that families who have lost their jobs might look for alternative illegal means of having an income. One of these could be selling videos of sexual abuse of their children. Law enforcement partners reported increased online activity by those seeking child abuse material. In this situation, there is a risk that families who have lost their jobs might look for alternative illegal means of having an income. One of these could be selling videos of sexual abuse of their children. The police has also warned on new types of live streaming due to the increased demand for the creation of pornographic content. Okay, now in modern slavery literature, it is acknowledged that sometimes parents are exploited, okay? And by that I mean parents get into debt to dodgy people. And then those dodgy people exploit the parents to exploit their children. Sometimes parents get into bother, and this is an illicit, evil, criminal way to make money because there is a demand for it. 25% of the entire internet's pornography is child pornography. It is a really hard reality to think about, but it is what happens. Or it's something we need to be aware of. Definitely. Okay? People are also talking about school closures may lead to an escalation of child trafficking cases. Many children have lost their subsidised school meals, which is posing a new burden on fragile homes. Consequently, many children might be forced into child labour or child marriage. Obviously, child marriage, that is relevant in the UK. Child labour is also relevant in the UK too. If you have an impoverished single mother, it is possible that she could get a job, a domestic cleaning job, and make her child work with her, and that the person who's paying them is paying for both of the people to be there. The profound economic hardship caused by COVID-19 outbreak is exposing the most vulnerable to risks of sexual exploitation, while current victims of human trafficking are at higher risks of becoming further abused and exploited. The impact of the current crisis is particularly strong on women and girls who are generally earning less, saving less, and are more involved in the informal economy, which makes them more vulnerable to exploitation. There is substantive evidence on how previous pandemics, such as the 2014 Ebola outbreak, has provided wider opportunities for exploiters to exploit people in need, especially women and girls, and pushed women to offer sex in exchange for food or vaccination. Since outreach activities and pathways to receive assistance and help are disrupted, the identification of victims in sexual exploitation might be harder, which makes them more invisible and vulnerable to further exploitation. Restriction of movement, which is already inherent to trafficking for sexual exploitation, is further amplified by the lockdown measures and travel restrictions. Thus, victims of sexual exploitation might find themselves in a more desperate situation and unable to find an exit route. Moreover, along with the increase in reports of domestic violence, victims of sexual exploitation might face abuses and physical and psychological violence perpetrated by their exploiters, especially when they share the same premises, and that is just obvious. So while we were all sitting in our homes in lockdown, getting Asda, Tesco's, and Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's to deliver us our food, deliver us from evil, deliver us from COVID-19, people were having to share premises with traffickers. Not very nice. Restrictions on movement may shift forms of exploitation. As a consequence, women and children may be commercially, sexually exploited by their traffickers online or within private homes. Okay? So we're going to see, we're not going to have the traditional sort of brothel I know locally that actually one of the things that traffickers have been doing now is using Airbnb. They have been renting Airbnb houses and using those temporarily to have pop-up brothels. Pop-up brothels are not a new thing, and now they're being used on Airbnb. And online trafficking and grooming, live streaming, pornography and abuse. These things need to be contrasted against the overly positive accentuation of virtual church. So while we sit at home and remonstrate about how great it is that we can sit at home and still be in church, and isn't it wonderful, this church is changing, and church is this, and church is that, and this is happening, the flip side to that is the fact that these people are being exploited, and online exploitation is increasing. Physical exploitation, where you have the John coming to a house and abusing somebody and paying their handler or their pimp or abuser or parent. That's changing. So, but there's still violence involved. Okay, so people are watching violence, and they're paying to watch violence. They're paying to watch a child or a woman or even a man being abused, so abuse still has to happen. They're not watching Netflix, they're not watching Scooby-Doo, okay? And sure, maybe there might be some form of mitigation in the fact that, well, at least that one person isn't being abused by 100 people, but there might be 100 people watching it. It doesn't lessen the damage, okay? And this is, as I said, this is the flip side of what we're facing right now. We're facing the government withdrawing modern slavery legislation because it suits us. It suits them to protect us and to protect those of us who feel the need to be protected. Okay? But the reality is that you're protecting one group of people at the expense of the most vulnerable. And in light of all of this, we need to consider, how does the church respond? It is not enough to just throw off the responsibility, to pass the buck to our Christian parachurch organisations. It is not enough to say, well, that's the government's job. The evidence and the data have pointed that these victims look to faith organisations. They look to church, they look to God, they look to Christians, which means they look to you and me. And I have to emphasise this because I didn't emphasise it in my work, in my research, because I took it for granted. I took it for granted that churches today know what is needed and know what is expected of them according to the Bible. This. We have slaves set free in this book. We have people walking out of Egypt in this book. We have people seeing the walls of Jericho torn down and prostitutes being saved and becoming within the lineage of Christ. Yeah, we have all these things. We have slaves and masters in the New Testament church. We have a system, multiple systems of slavery in this, from Egypt to Babylon the Great in the book of Revelation. And somehow we have managed to forget what is important. We have forgotten our identity. We have forgotten our history and our heritage, our culture. Yeah? The culture that transcends nation and race and tongue. Because we are all united in Christ. We have forgotten that. And we have followed the world. Because it is the world and our society and our governments who have decided what the priority is. And that the priority today is COVID-19. And constraining COVID-19 to the expense of the vulnerable. So I have set forth the evidence before you. I have read out the articles. I have gathered the data. I've done the research, and I have showed it to you, and I've presented it to you, and hopefully to this point you have listened. But the church in Northern Ireland, we owe it. We owe it to the victims. We owe it to the oppressed. We owe it to slaves, to children, to do something. To at least keep our doors open. So at least even if you're never going to go out to the red light districts in Belfast, even if you're never going to search out the brothels in Enniskillen or Omagh or any of the other towns and cities in this country, on this island, even if you're never going to go there, even if you're never going to try and find prostitutes to tell them the gospel or to help them, even if you're never going to run a campaign, if you can at least keep your doors open so those people have somewhere to go. 1 day a week. 1 day a week. You have no idea the difference that can make. If you can be welcoming and hospitable, if you can show that you're different, these people are afraid. These people are afraid of the authorities. None of the people surveyed said that they would go to a council. Only 2 people surveyed said that they would go to the police for help. Only half of them said they'd go to a medical professional. They all said they would go to a church.